talking about, I asked the question, what time is it? What time is it? Not so much what time is it on the clock back there, but what time is it in light of history? What time is it according to God's plan? You know, one of the reasons he gave us the Bible was to chronologically unfold events that have taken place now for 6,000 years and to establish certain demarcations along the way that were almost like the handing of a baton, to be honest with you. If we study history, it's made up of generations. And when a generation comes to an end, they hand the baton off to the next generation. It's not typically a day or a date, but it's a time and a season when Moses handed off the baton to Joshua and he brought the children of Israel into the promised land. We have all these, when David handed the baton off to Solomon. You know, David wanted to build a temple, and God said, no, you've been a man of war. Now, that wasn't some kind of a negative thing on David. He needed to be a man of war because the land needed to be cleaned out and cleared off so that the children of Israel could possess that land. Solomon, his son, comes along. David's got all the materials ready. David's got the plans ready. And Solomon goes and begins the building of the temple. They could have a temple, instead of a tabernacle that moved with them, they weren't moving anymore. That was going to be their land. So we see these times of handing off. Not only are we as a church and we as a couple and as a leadership team handing off the future of the church into the hands of the next generation, but there's more written in the Bible about the days we're living in today than any other time. Now, that should interest us. We shouldn't just say, oh, that's kind of cool. More written from the Old Testament, the New Testament, prophecies, prophets, Ezekiel, even back in the Psalms, Daniel. Then we end up with the book of Revelation, which many people look at and they're like, wow, that's a pretty cool book, but I have no idea what it means. It's all really speaking of the last days, the end times. And so I shared a couple of weeks ago, I said, do you know what time it is? I continue to use this scripture that the sons of Issachar, who were part of Israel in the Old Testament, the sons of Issachar, they knew the times and they knew what Israel ought to do. So God doesn't just reveal times to us so we can say, oh, that's pretty neat, but we need to know what to do. What do I need to do during this time? Because, this time of my life, I'm in the, I don't know what they call it, but it's just going down the other side of the mountain, whatever it might be. That's just realistic, is that we've most likely lived longer than we're going to live, okay? We've accomplished things. We're going to continue the work, but we're probably not going to be here in another 40 years, okay? I don't know. Maybe none of us are going to be here in the next 40 years. So you live in a lifetime. You live a lifetime, and in it, you have a different perspective. My perspective of life is different today than it was when we started the work when we were in our 20s. Okay? Our perspective is very different. Our perspective is different than Pavel and Maria's perspective. That's the way it needs to be, so that there's that continuation of enthusiasm and vision and so on and so forth. So when the Lord tells us about things, we need to really adjust, no matter whether you're 5 today or 15 or 35 or 55 or whatever. We all need to adjust to what it is that God is doing today, okay? And not, sometimes when we hear messages and we look at something like we're going to be looking at for the next few weeks in Matthew 24, and I'm going to share some perspective on it from my perspective. Sometimes when we look at things and we start hearing about last days and end times, people get bummed out. They're like, oh, what do you mean? I haven't lived the fullest of my life yet. I haven't gotten married yet. I haven't had children yet. I haven't seen my kids grow up and graduate yet. We haven't paid for our house yet. We haven't, and there's all these things that come against us that can be negative, but we need to realize that we already sang about, serve a good God, don't we? The day is going to come when someone finishes the race. When you watch the Olympics aren't still going on. They're not still running around that track over there. You leave at the starting gun and you finish when the race is over. And so we need to realize that, first of all, as Christians, okay, and if you're not a Christian, this should motivate you quite a bit. As Christians, the race doesn't end, okay? The conflict ends, the struggle ends, the battle ends, but there's going to be a transition with the Lord, and it's not just that we die and rot in the ground. The transition with the Lord is a new heaven and a new earth wherein all those who live righteously are going to dwell, with a new body where sin will no longer be a part of anything that happens. I mean, it's almost like, really, that's going to be awesome, or else some people are still stuck with babies with bow and arrows floating around in the clouds as far as what it's going to be like on the other side. That's why God gave us His Word. We have a glorious transition taking place. Even for those who die and pass away, if they know Christ, I can give you a good report. Okay? So God has really blessed us with letting us know things about the future that are a blessing to us while He hasn't given us all the details. And so I'm here to tell you to embrace, I want to encourage you, embrace the day that you're in and embrace God in the day that you're in, because it's a good day. That doesn't mean bad things won't be happening around us, but it still can be a good day. And I believe that it is. And so I want to talk about the key this morning. I talked a couple weeks ago about being a spiritual prepper. In other words, we need to be preparing for the days that are ahead. There are things that God tells us that will allow us to prepare. And so I looked back in, and you can go back here on your own into Romans 13, verses 13 and 14. That's not where we're going right now. That's the section that I preached from the last couple weeks. I want to look at Matthew 24 right now. And we're going to start taking a look at the signs of the times. Okay, we're going to be looking for a few weeks now at the signs of the times that are in the book of Matthew, chapter 24. It is clearly recognized, and I'm going to read a little bit of it here in just a minute. It's recognized as a chapter. It goes into Matthew 25 that is also part of this message. It goes into a chapter that is focused on when Jesus is with His disciples, and it's focused on the last days. It's focused on the end times. I have a feeling that many of them thought that they were probably in them then, that probably were looking at maybe a few months or a few years down the road. So they came curious and asked Him some questions. So let's look at Matthew 24, 1 through 3. And so this will not, I'm asking God to help me today to cover as much ground as I want to cover, and yet realize that we're not going to finish this up by any means this morning. Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple. And His disciples came up to show Him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Assuredly, I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down." Now as He sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to Him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be? What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" So as a result of them being there where the temple at this point isn't just one building, there's the main temple, but then there's other buildings that are connected to it and so on, as gates of access and entry and so on and so forth. But they sat on the Mount of Olives and they're looking down upon the temple, and that area in Jerusalem is still very much there today. It's called the Temple Mount. There's some buildings on it at this point in time, not getting into that this morning. But they basically asked Him three questions. The first question was, when will these things be? Sometimes people have a tendency to tie all these together and try to establish a time that all three of these happen at the same time, okay? And so they end up arguing about the temple, when the temple was going to be built. Some people think that this all happened back in 70 A.D., and so on and so forth, because they don't differentiate between the three questions that are being asked in this sentence. The first question is, when will these things be? What things? The destruction of the temple, okay? When will these things be? When will what you just showed us? You said there won't be one stone left upon another of this building. When's that going to happen? And we know historically that happened in 70 A.D., which was probably about 35 years later that happened, okay? History teaches us and tells us that when the Romans came in and attacked Jerusalem, that they tore down the temple and there was not one stone left upon another. But they asked Him two other questions also. They said, "What will be the sign of your coming?" So obviously He has not come again yet. And so we're looking at 2,000 more years down the road, and if we try to shove all those together, we end up trying to make things happen that I believe are not going to happen, because one of them already did, and that is the destruction of the temple. This has significance. You're going to have to connect the dots with me as I go along, and I'm hoping to end it with a clear, singular message for what I'm sharing this morning, which will catapult us then into the next couple weeks. Then the third question, what will be the sign of the end of the age? So one question has to do with the temple. The other question has to do with his return. And the other question has to do with what season what will it be like at the end of the age, okay? There's going to be a return of Christ that's going to happen in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye. Jesus is going to come back, and it's not going to take him 6 weeks to do it. When it happens, he says nobody will even know that it's going to happen, and bingo, it's going to happen. But they also ask, what's it going to be like in the days, in those last days, in those end times, that it's going to preclude the day that you come back and return, the second coming of Christ? So, how can we know these things? There have been books written on end times. I'm not sure if you're familiar with a guy named Nostradamus. There have been other psychics that have come along and trying to give messages from the other side. There have been predictors that have come along. So how can we know? How can we really know if we're in the end times or not? Well, there's really one way. God's got to show you. Okay? Because the only one who knows about tomorrow is who? Is God. Okay? The only one that knows the details, the only one that has already seen tomorrow and the next day and the next day and 1,000 years from now and so on is God. And so it doesn't really do any good to go and get your horoscope read. Doesn't do any good to go get somebody to read the tarot cards. Doesn't do any good to get somebody to come along that seems exciting and maybe they've made a couple predictions that are kind of close and say, oh, I think this guy's really got the corner on the market. The only way we can know about the days we're living in is by hearing from God. Okay? And so two things are required to do that. One is prayer, and the other is His Word. Okay? One is prayer, because in prayer, God will speak to you sometimes about things. I've had God speak things to me many times personally about my own life or about our family or about the church sometimes that have come by the voice of the Holy Spirit during a season or a time of prayer. Other times it's been, as we're doing this morning, as we look at the Scriptures and see what did He say in the Bible concerning these days. If He said some things already, shouldn't we go and look at what He said? And then again, you combine that with prayer, and we're asking God to take what He's written and to reveal it to us so we know what to do in our day. If the sons of Issachar thousands of years ago could understand the times and what to do in their day, I believe we on this side of the cross, with the Holy Spirit indwelling the believer, we ought to have an idea what's going on. As a matter of fact, He said this in Matthew 16:3. You don't have to put it up there. He says, he talked to the religious leaders. He says, what do you say when the sky is pink at night? And it says, they said, well, it's going to be a good day tomorrow. What about when it's, so He's talking about he says, you know what? You can interpret the signs of the sky, but you can't interpret the signs of the times. And He didn't say you can't because I don't want you to. He was really rebuking them and saying, you can't interpret the day you're living in when you ought to, because you claim to be someone who knows and hears from God. So people who know and hear from God should be able to have some input and some revelation and some definition to the day that we're living in today, especially if we are living in this time frame called the last days or the end times. I'm not trying to say, we're in the last 5 years, we're in the last 25 years, we're in the last 100 years. I don't know how long that's going to be. Again, we'll look at some scripture that seems to put a cap on the other end of it. And it has a lot to do with what I'm going to talk about this morning. That's why what I'm saying this morning becomes so significant. Might be a little boring to you as we talked about Israel, but it's interesting how God used and uses Israel as a timepiece, okay, as a timepiece to reveal to us times and seasons of things that are going on. How many of you know that there's stuff going on in Israel today that is very unique, okay, very, very chaotic, very special, and it's part of what we're talking about from Matthew 24. So how do we know? Because God has foreknowledge. Okay? Acts 2:23, Him, talking about Jesus, being delivered by the determined purpose and foreknowledge of God, you have taken by lawless hands, have crucified, and have put to death. God has foreknowledge because He's God. And so that's why God could have prophets write things down in a book hundreds, thousands of years in advance, and have those things come to pass later on, because God already knew what was going to happen. That's part of who God is. If that's too big for you, I guess you'll just have to live with that. But I thank God that God knows the future. I thank God that God has my path set for me. I thank God that He occasionally gives me a peek behind every once in a while by the Holy Spirit to give us guidance and direction. So there are 6 primary signs in Matthew 24. We're just going to look at one of them this morning because I believe it is the key. Okay? Remember an indicator. What is an indicator? It shows us, it points us in a direction, an indicator. When you turn your turning signals on, technically, a turning signal is called an indicator light. Okay? So as it's blinking to the left, it means you're telling the person behind you or in front of you that you're getting ready to turn left and they need to pay attention, right? It's an indicator, all right? Talk to you about baseball before. Talk to you about when you see the coaches down there on third base, doing all this kind of stuff and so on, and you're wondering, gee, how does anybody know what the heck they're doing? They don't want anybody to know what's going on. They want the guy that's right over there to know what's going on. And it's because one of those maneuvers is an indicator that the next one is going to be the one I want you to pay attention to. Okay? It's an indicator. It kicks it in. It's like a key. You want to get on the other side of that door, you need to know where the key is. Big door, big lock, big handle. Can't get through there. Little tiny key will open that door. What is the key to Matthew 24? The key to Matthew 24 is Israel. Okay? Is Israel. And so here is where I want to... I've been slightly stressed out for a day or two about, Lord, how am I going to get this out in a way that is purposeful, but not too long. Okay? So, of course, this morning we have 14 announcements, and we get, blessed and honored and a couple other things. But bear with me because this is important in your life, okay? We got to take a look at a chunk of history from Israel. And I know that the vast majority of people in this room have very little knowledge of Israel. It's just the way that it is. I wouldn't have any if I wasn't saved in the pastorate and began, studying and preparing myself for days that would come that would be important, since the whole Old Testament is about Israel. The first thing I want to throw at you, just to hang on to for about 15 minutes, is something that was within the framework of first of all, Israel. Who is Israel, anyhow? I mean, it's one of the smallest geographical sized countries on the face of the earth. Who are these people? There seems to be all kinds of issues going on today concerning Israel. There seems to be people that have strong opinions, people that are, saying things that are very negative about Israel. And so, why would we even talk about that place today? Well, Israel was God's chosen people, is God's chosen people, okay? God chose Israel. If we go back to Genesis 12, which again, we're not going back there, but God established a covenant with a guy by the name of Abraham. Okay? And He said to Abraham, in essence, I'm going to give you a special place for you to raise your family and for generations to come out of your loins. In other words, there'll be multiple generations that will multiply and multiply like the sands of the sea and the stars of the sky. And you're going to have a special relationship with me because you and I are going to have a covenant together. Okay? It's kind of like having a special relationship with your spouse. When we get married, we establish a covenant, okay? Not just going out on a date, not just hanging out, not just living together. There's a covenant that takes place in the sight of marriage. Well, was also here. And so God made a covenant with Abraham and his seed. And so we see Abraham had a child by the name of Isaac, and Isaac had a son by the name of Jacob, and Jacob's name was changed to Israel, okay? And so here's where it began. And later on, we see the entering into the promised land by Joshua after Moses led them. There's just so many years in there I'd love to talk about, but what's relevant for today is that Israel is God's chosen people. Okay? And so he established with them, this is important, an everlasting covenant. So it's not a covenant that stopped when Jesus was born. When Jesus came into play, God established a new covenant that includes all of us. But the old covenant with Israel still is in play today, and that's why we need to pay attention to what's going on there. I'm not saying Israel is great, is all godly and they're doing fabulous things for God. I'm not saying they are or aren't. Okay? I'm just saying that if you were born out of the loins of Abraham and Abraham is your father, not by faith, but by lineage, then you're part of a people that God established an everlasting covenant with. So God is still functioning with Israel today, while he's also the God of the Gentiles too, through Jesus Christ. So I want to get back to Israel again. Part of their time when they were wandering through the wilderness, when the law was being given to Moses, when God was establishing a very special relationship with the Israelites, with the children of Abraham. Well, this is one of the things he established with them. It's called a year of Jubilee. Okay? A year of Jubilee. And in essence, it's this. You may lose your land. You may lose your possessions. You may make an unwise business decision, and that's how you lose them. An enemy might come in and steal things away, whatever the case might be. But the year of Jubilee amongst the Israelites, okay, I'm not saying the other nations were part of this, but amongst the Israelites, every 50 years, you were given back what you'd lost, or you went back to the place that you lost, okay? The year of Jubilee. Let me just read you one verse on the whole thing, just so you understand what I'm saying. Leviticus 25, 8 through 13. And you shall count 7 Sabbaths of years for yourself, 7 times 7 years. And the time of the 7 Sabbaths of years shall be to you 49 years. Then you shall cause the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month in the day of atonement. And you shall make the trumpet to sound throughout all your land. And you shall consecrate the 50th year, and proclaim liberty throughout all the land to all the inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you, and each of you shall return to his possession, and each of you shall return to his family. That 50th year shall be a jubilee to you. In it you shall neither sow nor reap what grows of its own accord, nor gather the grapes of your untended vine, for it is the jubilee. It shall be holy to you. You shall eat its produce from the field. In this year of Jubilee, each of you shall return to his possession. So for these thousands of years, there was this time of Jubilee that would happen on at the end of the 49th year, coming into the 50th year, that your debts were covered. If you had debt, they were wiped clean. If you'd lost your land over something, it was given back to you. And it was just an amazing part of God's covenant with Israel, okay? Let that sit on the shelf, because I got to bring that back in just a little bit. In Leviticus 26, I'd love to read that chapter. I just can't take the time to do it this morning. It's also in Deuteronomy 28, 29, and 30. Some of you will be familiar with this, but it's where God, through Moses, tells them how they need to live as his covenant people when they enter into the land. And he lists a bunch of things that if you do this, you will be blessed by me. But, in other words, if you keep my covenant, is what he says. And if you do these things, this is part of the covenant with me, and you will have a blessing of protection, of provision, and all of that. Your land will bear much fruit, so on and so forth. Your animals will produce everything that in an agricultural society you'd want to have happen. But then he says, however, if you do not, if you break the covenant, if you serve other gods, if you start running off and serving the gods of the people that live around you and entering into relationship with them, then this is what's going to happen. And you got a whole chapter of judgment and things that are going to happen that will cause them to be destroyed, okay? Their land to be destroyed, their fruitfulness, all of that. I would encourage you, Leviticus 26, Deuteronomy 28, 29, and 30. Those are 4 chapters, but if you want, it will give you substance to what I'm talking about here, okay? So God's promise of blessing or cursing. In the middle of it, so I'm going to read these 2 verses out of the middle of Leviticus 26, 11 and 12. In the middle of all that, he says also, I will set my tabernacle among you, and my soul shall not abhor you. I will walk among you and be your God, and you shall be my people. So God gave Moses a pattern on the mount to build this thing called the tabernacle. There are depictions of it today. We had one on the wall at one time, but I think something happened to it anyhow. Of this, it was called the tent of meeting, and it was made in a very specific way, with specific materials used and exactly this number of tent stakes and tent poles and made of badger skin. And there was an outer court that you would come into, and then there's an inner court, and then there's a holy of holies, and about all the utensils that will be into it. It's a wonderful study to do sometime. Actually, the tabernacle is we are a type of the tabernacle, because there were 3 rooms, and the most central one was the place where the Ark of the Covenant was, where the Holy of Holies was. And you and I, according to 1 Thessalonians 5:23, we are body, soul, and spirit. The outer court, my soul is the inner court, and my spirit is the Holy of Holies. And that's why that's why we need to get born again, because when we get born again, we get born of the Spirit. And it's actually the presence of God taking up residence within the Holy of Holies again. Another whole teaching, okay? Don't want to go down that path right now. But anyhow, he says, I'm going to set my tabernacle among you. I'm not going to be your God from way out here. I'm going to be your God from being right there. I'm going to be with you at all times. Israel went out into battle against armies that were 30, 40 times bigger than they were, and they utterly defeated the enemy. That doesn't make an ounce of sense how that all happened, but it happened because God was on their side. When they didn't serve the Lord the way they should, they get whooped by 15 people. So he's a covenant guy. I'll compare this to marriage again too. When you go and we have our wedding day and we share our vows and we have our honeymoon, and just like this is absolutely tremendous. Well, let me tell you what, the next 40 years, the next 50 years are going to require you to be relationship with each other. And because men and women are made so differently, it's like trying to mix water and oil sometimes, going through that process of building relationship. It's the same type of a thing. You may have a wedding, but your marriage is going to go on for 40, 50 years. And as you go on, that's where the rubber's going to meet the road. That's where we're going to have a little bit of this kind of stuff. So when it came to Israel, as long as they walked in obedience, they were going to be blessed. And when they walked in disobedience, they were going to have problems. And so God said, but I'm going to be in the midst of you. And so he established this system of the tabernacle and of the Levites and of the priesthood and so on. So we moved down the road to the time God's tabernacle turned into God's temple. When did it turn into the temple? Hundreds of years later, when the children of Israel came into the land and now they were home. This would be their land. And so rather than having a tent that they could move around through the wilderness all the time, every time God said, okay, it's time to move, got to tear down the tent, got to go wherever he says stop, they set it back up again. He says, now you're going to build a temple. The temple's going to be made out of stone. Remember what Jesus said in Matthew 24. Not one stone of this building is going to remain standing in the future. So there's this temple that they built. David cleaned the land out. Solomon built the temple called Solomon's Temple. The very first temple, it was destroyed by the Philistines many years later. But just the fact, the first temple, okay, the tabernacle was the tabernacle of Moses. The first temple was the temple of Solomon. And then it was destroyed, excuse me, it was destroyed by a guy named Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. You can read about that in 2 Kings 25, and it was destroyed in 587 BC. In 517 BC, the second temple, built by Herod the Great, with the stones that were left from the first one. So if any of you remember reading about that a little bit, some of the fathers that had saw the first temple, and now it'd be like Darrell building the whole front of the church with all used material, okay? And they'd stand back and go, really? It doesn't look anything like the glorious first temple. But nonetheless, it served its purpose, okay? And God's message to us today is you don't have to have all your stuff together to come to God, okay? We're all burnt stones in a little way, aren't we? We're all little crackpots, aren't we, in a little way when we come to the Lord? Okay? But God says, no, it's not what it looks like on the outside, it's what happens on the inside. And so the second temple was built by Herod the Great. We read about that in Ezra and Nehemiah. Okay? Nehemiah is all about the rebuilding of the wall, and then Ezra speaks a lot about how the temple was rebuilt. I can't even get into the ark. Let me just say this for those of you that are familiar with the Ark of the Covenant. It was not in the temple, okay? It had been gone for a while before this, All right? So they had the temple, but they didn't have the ark. Then again, Matthew 24, I just read, Jesus said, not one stone will be left on another. And so therefore, we see that in 70 A.D., there was the destruction of that second temple. There has not been a third temple built. There will be. Okay? And that's an important part of the day that we're living in. This is one of the things to watch for. Okay? To watch for, because he said the temple would not be rebuilt until the day of my return. Not the day of my return, but the season of my return. So we've been 70 A.D., you know, where are we at? We're a couple thousand years, almost, 1950 down the road, and there's been no third temple. As a matter of fact, what's happened is the children of Israel were scattered in 70 A.D., and they have not, I won't say right now, they had not returned to their land even at the beginning of the 1900s. So when Jesus talks about these things, he's saying when you see this happening, okay, well, how do we know there's not a fourth time? Because he didn't say there would be. He says the next time you see these things happening, you need to know that the day is close, okay? So what we're going to do over the next few weeks is we're going to talk about things that are happening today that Jesus defined in Matthew 24 as being unique to that time, and I'm going to give you some statistics along with it to show you that we are living in that day. Okay, I'm not there yet, though. We'll do that next week. I'm still with Israel for just a minute, but I've done really good. Okay, I've done really good, so I'm feeling good about myself right now. Okay, time-wise. Okay, so Israel was scattered and persecuted. All right, let me read in Deuteronomy 29, a couple verses there, 21 through 23. This is back in this covenant section of chapters. He says this. I've taken this out of it, just like I did the year of Jubilee. It says, and the Lord would separate him from all the tribes of Israel for adversity according to all the curses of the covenant that are written in the book of the law, so that the coming generation of your children who rise up after you and the foreigner who comes from afar would say, when they see the plagues of the land and the sickness which the Lord had laid on it, the whole land is brimstone, salt, and burning. It's not sown, nor does it bear, nor does any grass grow therein. Like the overthrow of Sodom and Gomorrah, Admah and Zeboim, which the Lord overthrew in his anger and in his wrath. Again, we're going back to God saying that if Israel, if they disobey me, and if they go and begin to covenant with other gods and other, religions and so on, I'm gonna not only let the land go to pot, but I'm gonna let the land have it. Okay? So Israel did that. They were scattered, and the land of Israel was an utterly desolate place, all the way up through and even into the 1800s. I read it says it was one of the most desolate wastelands after it had been such a fruitful land before. Remember when Joshua, when they went in and the grapes were so big they had to have a pole between two men to carry the cluster of grapes, what this land was like. And here we are, of course, many, many years later, and the land is shot. They said no one would want to go live in the land. No one would want to be there. There were Bedouins that lived in the land. There were those that were always traveling and just kind of, I mean, you probably watched a movie, about that time and got a few camels and a few tents, but they're just living in a place that is just totally, totally desolate. Who would want to go there? But the reason it was in that condition was because of their disobedience. But this is what God said. He said, there's going to come a day that the children of Israel hearts are going to turn toward me. And there's going to be a process of them coming back to their land. And they're going to come back to their land, and I'm going to cause it to be fruitful again. Okay? So remember, we're talking about timing here. This is really about times, not just events. He mentioned in the verse I just read that there will be and this is prophetic really, that the foreigner will come from afar and say that the land is of plagues, sickness, the land is brimstone, salt, burning, it's not sowing, it doesn't bear, nor does any grass grow therein. Now, God also says that before he does anything in the earth, he first makes it known prophetically. Okay? He first makes it known in advance, talked about God's foreknowledge earlier, because God knows the future. A true prophet is somebody that's not guessing at what's going on. There's someone who's an instrument that God is speaking through, words of future. Okay? There are over 320 prophecies about Jesus, the Messiah, that were written down before Jesus was ever born, and he fulfilled every one of them. Okay? So this is the coolness of God and how that all works and how he speaks and reveals things in advance, which is why Jesus said to the Pharisees, "Man, you guys ought to know who I am. I mean, there are only all these prophecies that were written that you preach about, and you're like, hello, because you're not wanting to see what the Father revealed in his word through the prophets for you to see, so that when he came, they would go, here's the Messiah." All right? Israel today, much of Israel, is still waiting for the Messiah to come. They're waiting for Jesus to come the first time. Okay? So I'm not saying Israel's got it all together, but I'm saying they are God's covenant people. Okay? So, in 1867, a man by the name of Mark Twain. Anyone familiar with him at all? Okay? Mark Twain, who at that time was back in the 1860s, it wasn't a global society like it is today where something sneezes over in the Middle East and you know about it, before the wind gets over here. It was just, it's not the way it happened. And so, but Mark Twain was very well known back in his day. I'm not going to say globally, but very well known amongst many different cultures, okay? And in 1867, he wrote for a publication that ended up going everywhere. And he said this about, he'd been in Israel for a month, and he said this about Israel. He said, "It is a desolate country whose soil is rich enough, but is given over wholly to weeds, a silent, mournful expanse." Now, Mark Twain's name originally was Samuel Clemens, right? His pen name was Mark Twain. Samuel means the Lord has heard, and Clemens, or where we get Clement in the New Testament, okay, means the Lord is merciful. And so when he made that statement, many believe that it was a prophetic statement that kicked into a fulfillment of Deuteronomy, where he, representing the non-Jew, came and made a statement about the land, which had been going on for hundreds of years, well over 1,000. But when he made that statement, that it tied into Deuteronomy here. Let's just go further. That one there is one that's like, that's interesting. Okay, 1867. In 1897, a man by the name of Theodore Herzl, who is known as the father of the state of Israel, he made a proclamation. He said that Israel is going to return to its land. Okay? His goal was to gather the Jews of the world together in their homeland with a government of their own at his summons. The first Zionist Congress convened and proclaimed the right of the Jewish people to national rebirth in its own country. So we've got a prophetic fulfillment. Now we have a proclamation being made by an Israelite leader that the Jews are coming back to their land and it's going to prosper again. Okay? Let me say this. Prophecy unfolds in bits and pieces sometimes. All right? If you've ever had a prophetic word spoken over you, it probably isn't something that tomorrow it happened. Okay? But it begins to unfold in bits and pieces. And when it is fulfilled in the end, you look back and you're like, now I understand. Now I see the pieces along the way. So the process of Jubilee, where does that fit into the whole thing? In 1917, the Ottoman Empire, which was Turkey, possessed the land of Israel. Okay, it was theirs. It was governed by them. Of course, that land was bordered on Turkey at that time. And a man by the name of General Edmund Allenby, he was a British general, came into Jerusalem in 1917 and delivered Again, the land had Arabs in it. The land had some wandering people in it, probably a few Jews hanging around there. But for the most part, the Jews, the Israelites, were scattered across the globe, all over the place. There were some in America. They were all over, all right? But at that time, he came in, and the British were very supportive at that time of Israel. And so he comes in and he leads his army in and delivers delivers Jerusalem from the Turks at that time, which basically were part of the Muslims in that out of all the different tribes. And when he did, he said this. He said, "As a child, my mother and I would pray every night before, as long as I can remember, and they'd pray this prayer every night." When he was a child. "O Lord, we would not forget thine ancient people, Israel. Hasten the day when Israel shall again be thy people and shall again be restored to thy favor and to their land." That was December 9th, 1917, that he entered Jerusalem. When he entered Jerusalem, he got off of his horse and he said, "I'm walking into Jerusalem because no one is worthy but the Lord to ride in on an animal." But this was his calling in life. And so in 1917, little does he know how it fits into things, but all of a sudden, for the first time in thousands of years, the land now, all of a sudden the government of the land was now in the hands of the British, okay? But it was taken out of the hands of those that had been in it, which had been the Turks for 400 years. That same year, the Balfour Declaration was brought forth by the British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour, and it supported the establishment of an independent homeland in Palestine adopted by the League of Nations. So now all of a sudden, there was a recognition that this is a land that the Israelites can come back and possess, okay? It hadn't happened yet, but there was a recognition governmentally. I'm almost done here, got a half a page. In 1947, Israel becomes an independent state, and the United States recognizes Israel as an independent state. Now, there's Jews and there's Palestinians inhabiting the land. There still is to this day, okay? Even as it is Israel, and the Israelites have the government of the land and so on. We think over there that there's no Arabs are allowed to live in the land. That's not true at all. They've been coexisting and living together for a long time now, okay? But in 47 is when they became an independent state, and in 1948, of course, right on the heels of this, is when they were restored as a nation. First time in thousands of years, 1947. In 1967, there was a 6-day war where Syria, Jordan, and Egypt attacked Israel, and Israel won the war and gained ground. They gained the Gaza Strip. They gained the Sinai Peninsula. In 6 days, this war started and ended. They gained the West Bank, and they gained the Golan Heights, and they got back into Jerusalem. This is very important. Jesus talks about the rebuilding of the temple, correct? Where does it have to be rebuilt? It's got to be in Jerusalem, okay? Up until this point, they didn't have Jerusalem. They were under attack. They didn't go out after it. They came under attack, and God in 6 days gave them a victory over 3 other nations, and they gained ground out of the whole thing. In 1997, the Yom Kippur War. How many people were alive in 97 in here, okay? All right, not everybody. The Yom Kippur War, Syria and Egypt again came and attacked the land. It lasted 17 days, and they defended the land. 2017. This is the part that I knew that I couldn't park on these and say all the things I'd like to say. 2017. So at this point, leading up to this, the land is back. Israel is back in the land. It has been restored to them. They are identified by it wasn't the United Nations then, it was, yes, thank you. It was the League of Nations that ended up becoming the United Nations. They recognized Israel. The United States recognized Israel. So now, you can say you're one thing, but it's when people recognize you for who you are that then it becomes more official. Okay, so now that had taken place. They're back there as a nation now. In 97, they come under attack, but they defend it. But what about Jerusalem? Jerusalem is there, but it is kind of in a nebulous zone because the Arabs have the Muslims have a holy site there, and yet it's on the site, the Dome of the Rock, where the temple's got to get built. And so while they possess it, but they're kind of sharing it. And then what happens in 2017? President Donald Trump on 12/6/17 officially recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Now, some of you don't even know that that happened when he was president, or it wasn't that big of a deal, but it was a huge deal prophetically. Okay? It was a huge deal prophetically. Not only did he recognize it, former presidents and administrations had recognized it, but they still kept their embassy in Tel Aviv, where President Trump moved them to Jerusalem, where the United States and a number of other countries now not only recognized it on paper, but they sent their embassy people to establish the embassy in Jerusalem to be the embassy with Israel, not Israel and somebody else. And that's where we stand today, okay? So my point being, everything is in place for the third temple to be built as far as property, possession, land, recognition, all of that. And that is why all hell is breaking loose over there at this point in time, from a spiritual standpoint, is because there is a battle, because the enemy knows that once that temple is rebuilt, everything will be finished for the Lord to come back again. Okay? There are those that believe in the church is going to leave before that time and whatever. I don't know where I am on all that deal. I'm planning on being here for quite a while. But anyhow, we're in that day today. We're in that day. The battles that are being fought even over this last year, if you remember what happened in October of last year, and all the lies that are being purported about Israel, and you know how they started this thing and how they're trying to take the land away from it. None of it's true according to Scripture. And so what's going on is this battle is happening over there. I'm talking about heavenly battles, okay? That's why we need to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. But the next thing, so what about, something huge is going to have to happen for the temple to be built on the Temple Mount, okay? This isn't a little thing. There's going to have to be either some type of a peace agreement or some type of a removal of what's up there right now that is very, very, very religious and precious to the Muslims. We don't know how that's going to happen. All I'm saying is, as of 17, everything is in place for this to happen. I want to close this morning with a 3-minute video. Okay, just so what's going on over there in the heart of of leaders and of there's a temple institute right now that it exists and has been for about 30 years in Israel, where the members, they are Levites. They follow their lineage back to the Levitical order, and they are currently preparing everything for the third temple to be built. They've prepared all the instruments, the utensils that go in it. I just saw a picture the other day of a huge altar where they would take and sacrifice the animals on this huge altar. It's not in place because obviously the place they don't have it yet, but they've rebuilt one of those. They're working with a whole group of people, men that will be that are of the order of Levi that are training to be priests. Okay? Now again, I'm not saying we have Jesus the high priest, okay? We have Jesus the Messiah has come. That's not relevant to us today as far as spirituality. But what I'm saying is this is what Jesus said is my clock that's going to come lead to my return. That's what I'm trying to say. Okay? I told you a few months ago, the red heifer, they have to have a red heifer, okay, that the ashes of the red heifer will consecrate that temple when it is built. And up until, I don't know, a year or so ago, there was no red heifer, okay? 5 of them have been sent over from Texas. One of them had one gray hair, and so that disqualified it. The other 5 right now, or the other 4, are in holding over there for the time that this happens, and they have to be used within 5 years. If they're not used within 5 years, they got to start all over again. So you see about the timing that we're in and how these kinds of things are important to recognize. Just want to play this real quick. Maybe it'll tell us just a little bit to end this morning. My whole point is this. What time is it? What time is it and how can we know? And then, of course, knowing what God wants us to do during this time of our life, whether you're a teenager, whether you're a college student, whether you're married, whether you're single, whether you're a parent, whether you're a grandparent. We are living in prophetic times. And it's not a day for us to live like business as usual. Okay? This isn't to say you got to quit your job or you need to, take a different curriculum. I'm not trying to say any of that. I'm just saying it's a day to be aware. Okay? Romans 13 and 14, the first words in it, wake up, O Christian. Okay? To be awake. So this is where we're going to finish this morning, is right here.